referring to a video I made a few minutes ago when I was talking about taking my kids to Manchester yesterday to the skate park, getting lost. We're near the park, and Nick said, "Oh, this feels right," and he was right. We were quite near to the park when he said that. In the last video I made, I was talking about what kind of environmental cues could be prompting him to say that, and I said they were most likely to be visual cues. But what I'm quite intrigued by is, why in that instance he would say this feels right. And I think I certainly have used that phrase before in that kind of context. "Oh, this feels right." It kind of indicates an intuitive sense that you're on the right lines, or you're on the right track, or you're in the right area, but perhaps doesn't capture some of the details, or perhaps you couldn't attest to some of the details. I think if you'd said, "Yeah, this looks right," I would have said what looks right about. I could have said what looks right about it, and if I had to say, "Actually, I don't know," I don't think he could have actually pointed out particular visual aspects of the environment which were giving him that sense that he was in the right area. So instead of saying "this looks right," he said "this feels right," and I think that's something that happens quite a lot. It's certainly something that I've done before. I wouldn't think it out in those terms, and I don't think Nick thought it out in those terms, but I think that's what's happening. And I'm just wondering why that is the case. I think given that I'm suggesting that the stimulus that promoted that sense of knowing where he was visual, but the expression of that sense, how he chose to say it, invoked a feeling response, a tactile response. This feels right. There's some kind of synaesthetic transformation going on there, or there's a kind of, I think that's probably accurate. There's a kind of synaesthetic transformation. So he's expressing something which probably originates in the visual in terms that evoke the tactile. And not just the tactile, actually. Feeling, I think, embraces not just tactile information, the touch of something on one's hand, but also things like texture, proprioception, sense of being being pushed and pulled. Those kinds of forces, I think, are all part of the feeling response. At least I've read certain amounts of information to support that idea. And possibly even pain, but that's something slightly different. So why is that synaesthetic transformation taking place, and why is it taking place between those two senses? Why isn't he saying, if he's going to make a synaesthetic transformation, why isn't he saying, this sounds right, or this tastes right, or why isn't he, this smells right? Why isn't he making those kind of suggestions as opposed to this feels right? I think there's a number of things playing into that. I know from some of the reading I've looked into is that when people use those synaesthetic transformations, they do tend to make them in quite an orderly fashion. There's an order from what are sometimes considered to be more ephemeral senses towards more concrete senses. Although I need to go into what I mean by that in a minute. But certainly there's a relatively consistent pattern where we talk about sounds, for example, as if they were either tactile surfaces or as if they were tastes or something closer to us. So we talk about, I think the example that I read, and I'll see if I can remember the article, was talking about sounds and even silences, things which would appear in the auditory sense as being sweet. But I think we also talked about being sharp, or about them being harsh. And these are descriptive terms which are not of the sound itself. Those are terms which would belong in the repertoire of taste or in the repertoire of touch, but we're applying them to sounds. The same thing applies to taste, actually. When we talk about taste, again, we talk about if we say something is sharp, we're really using, like a lemon, for example. If we're saying the taste of a lemon is sharp, we're using a tactile, haptic, feeling metaphor to describe something which is of taste. And similarly, if we're saying this malt whiskey is smooth, again we're applying tactile, haptic metaphors to tastes. And again, that's a consistency. At least that's how the thinking goes. That it's the tactile sense is more concrete than the gustatory, the taste sense. So there's a kind of an orderly pattern of representation by which we think certain senses present themselves in more concrete terms than other senses. Hearing is quite ephemeral, smell is quite ephemeral, perhaps even taste is quite ephemeral, whereas touch particularly is absolutely concrete and not abstract, or less abstract. So when we use synaesthetic transformations, we move in that direction from the abstract to the concrete. And I think that's what's happening with Nick. He's talking about a sense which is probably oriented around the visuals, although he can't remember the visual, and which is does not appear to be abstract. There is an abstraction about it, but he's talking about it in terms of feeling. It feels right, as if there is a kind of recognizable object in his consciousness, or in his non-conscious processing, I suppose. But he's kind of running his hands over, and it feels familiar to him. And he's expressing that haptic familiarity by saying this feels right. I guess if I was to pursue this line of thinking, I'm not sure if I can do it here, but it would be, why some senses are considered concrete and some are considered more abstract. Why is my looking at that tree across the field from me here, why is my looking at that a slightly more abstract idea than my walking up to the tree and feeling it? So if I say, for example, that the bark on that tree is rough, which it is, that's, it isn't, my eyes aren't producing any sense of roughness. I'm imagining its roughness through a synaesthetic transformation and my kind of knowledge of what trees feel like. But that texture of that bark I would call rough, even if it wasn't on the tree right now, and even if I haven't had the experience of talking about it or feeling it. So why is that the case? As I say, if I was going to have a stab at that, it would be to do with salience, and this is just a real, just winging it really. Certainly objects which are so close to you that they're pushing against your skin, or perhaps even inside the body, and are pushing against your proprioceptive sense and moving you in some way. Those objects are bound to be more salient, they're more relevant, they have more literal impact on your life, on your survival possibilities, on your way of being, than objects which are necessarily at a distance, which visual objects invariably are, auditory objects usually are, olfactory objects invariably are. These things might be unpleasant, threatening, dangerous, and something to be aware of, but they're not actually hitting you at that moment. So if I was to, I guess what I'm just starting to speculate about is that to the extent there's a gradient between the abstract and the concrete, in terms of how we describe things, that seems to correlate with a gradient between the less salient and the more salient, in terms of what kinds of opportunity or threat an object may pose to us. I'm not sure if I can sum all that up, but I suppose what I'm saying is the reason why someone might say this feels right is because they're applying a synaesthetic transformation to a visual experience, a non-conscious visual experience, and expressing that in terms which indicates the salience of that experience. I might go